Minus 50 degrees Celsius. That is not a typo. That is the reality of winter in the Arctic tundra, a temperature so extreme that exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, a cold so brutal that metal shatters like glass. A world where your next breath could freeze your lungs from the inside out. And yet, for thousands of years, indigenous families did not just survive these conditions. They thrived in them. They raised children. They celebrated. They built communities that lasted for generations. Meanwhile, most of us panic when our heating system breaks during a mild winter storm. How did they do it? How did entire families, elders, mothers, fathers, and young children not only endure but flourish in an environment that modern science considers barely habitable for humans? The answer is not magic. It is not luck. It is a mastery of survival engineering so sophisticated that modern technology still struggles to replicate it. These were not primitive people scraping by in hostile territory. These were master engineers, thermodynamics experts, and community architects who understood their environment better than any laboratory ever could. Picture this. It is January in the Arctic Circle. The sun has not risen in weeks. Temperatures have dropped to minus 50 degrees, with wind chills that push the effective temperature even lower. Snow stretches in every direction, broken only by jagged ice formations that could slice through modern winter gear like paper. The air itself seems to crystallize, forming ice fog that reduces visibility to mere meters. Now imagine you are responsible for keeping a family of 6 alive through this. No thermostat, no insulated walls, no grocery store, no emergency services. Just you, your knowledge, and the frozen wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. This was the daily reality for the Inuit, Yupik, Inupiaq, and dozens of other indigenous peoples who called the Arctic home. And not only did they survive, they created one of the most remarkable human adaptations to extreme environments in history. The first secret to their survival begins with something that seems counterintuitive, embracing the cold rather than fighting it. While modern thinking would suggest building the thickest possible barriers against the environment, indigenous Arctic peoples understood something profound. The cold itself could be a tool, not just an enemy. Take their approach to food preservation. In the modern world, we spend billions of dollars annually on refrigeration and freezing technology. We build massive cold storage facilities that consume enormous amounts of energy. We develop complex supply chains to keep food fresh from farm to table. The Inuit had perfected this system thousands of years before electricity existed. The entire Arctic landscape became their refrigerator. But calling it a refrigerator dramatically understates their sophistication. They developed specific techniques for different types of preservation. Fresh meat could be stored in snow caches that maintained precise temperatures, cold enough to preserve but not so cold that the meat became impossible to cut or consume. Fish were dried on wooden racks during the brief summer months, then frozen solid for winter storage. Berries and other plant foods were preserved in rendered animal fat, creating a stable, nutrient-dense food source that could last for months. The science behind this is fascinating. At minus 50 degrees Celsius, bacterial activity essentially stops. Food does not rot. It suspends in a state of near-perfect preservation. But simply freezing food creates problems. Ice crystals form within the cellular structure, damaging texture and nutrition when thawed. The indigenous solution? Never fully thaw the food. Cut frozen meat with specialized tools. Eat it raw or barely warmed. Let your body warmth do the final defrosting. This approach, often called country food by modern Arctic communities, was not just about survival. It was nutritionally superior. Cooking destroys many vitamins, particularly vitamin C. In an environment where plant sources of vitamins were extremely limited, eating raw or minimally prepared animal products provided essential nutrients that prevented diseases like scurvy, a condition that would later devastate European Arctic explorers who insisted on their cooked, salt-preserved foods. The Inuit term for this raw, frozen fish delicacy is kwakyu. The meat version is tuktukwak when it is caribou. These were not desperate survival foods. They were preferred delicacies, enjoyed by choice as much as necessity. But food preservation was just the beginning. The real engineering marvel lay in how indigenous Arctic peoples kept themselves warm in conditions that should have killed them within hours. The centerpiece of Arctic indigenous shelter engineering is the igloo, but probably not the igloo you are imagining. The domed snow houses that appear in cartoons and movies represent just one type of indigenous Arctic shelter, and even that type is far more sophisticated than most people realize. First, let us understand why snow works as a building material in the first place. Snow is actually an excellent insulator. Fresh snow is about 90 to 95% trapped air, and air is one of the best insulators available. The snow blocks used in igloo construction have been compacted by wind and time, giving them structural strength while maintaining their insulating properties. A well-constructed igloo can maintain interior temperatures around 0 degrees Celsius, or even warmer, while exterior temperatures plummet to -50 or below. That is a temperature differential of 50 degrees or more, maintained by nothing but carefully cut snow blocks arranged in a specific spiral pattern. The construction technique itself demonstrates masterful understanding of structural engineering. The blocks are cut at precise angles, each one leaning slightly inward as the spiral rises. No central support is needed because each block bears weight on the ones below it. The dome shape distributes stress evenly, creating a structure strong enough to support a person weight on top. But the igloo is not just a snow dome. It is a complete thermal management system. The entrance is positioned below the main floor level, creating a cold trap that prevents the warmer interior air from escaping. A small ventilation hole at the top prevents carbon dioxide buildup while allowing warm air to circulate. Raised sleeping platforms position the occupants in the warmest zone, where heat naturally rises and collects. Some igloos included additional features that would impress modern architects. Snow shelves served as storage. Window panels made from clear freshwater ice let in light during the brief daylight hours. Seal oil lamps called kullik provided both light and supplemental heat. Their flames carefully managed to maximize warmth without dangerously depleting oxygen. The Inuit could construct an igloo in under an hour, faster than setting up most modern camping tents. Experienced builders worked with smooth, practiced movements that looked effortless but represented generations of accumulated knowledge and skill. Yet the igloo was designed for specific circumstances, temporary shelter during hunting trips or travel. For longer-term habitation, indigenous Arctic peoples developed even more sophisticated structures. The semi-subterranean sod houses of the Inupiaq and Yupik peoples represent perhaps the most thermally efficient human dwellings ever created. These structures, called barabara in some regions, combined the insulating properties of Earth with ingenious heating and ventilation systems. Construction began by digging into the earth, sometimes 3 or 4 feet deep. This immediately placed the living space below the frost line, where ground temperatures remain relatively stable year-round. The walls were built up with driftwood frames covered in layers of sod, moss, and sometimes additional snow insulation. Like the igloo, these homes featured entrance tunnels positioned below floor level to trap cold air. But they also incorporated sophisticated smoke holes that could be adjusted to control both ventilation and temperature. In some designs, the entrance tunnel had multiple turns, creating an even more effective cold trap. The heat source in these homes was remarkably minimal. Seal oil lamps burning slowly and steadily provided enough warmth to keep the interior comfortable. Body heat from the occupants added to the warmth. The earth itself, surrounding the structure on multiple sides, provided stable temperature buffering that reduced both heating needs and temperature fluctuations. Inside these homes, families lived comfortably. They engaged in craft work, told stories, raised children, and maintained rich social lives through the long Arctic winter. The homes were large enough to host visitors. Communities gathered for celebrations. Life continued even as temperatures outside remained lethal. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every story here is a doorway into human resilience that schools never taught you. Subscribe now. You deserve to know what your ancestors were truly capable of. If shelter was the first layer of defense against the cold, clothing was the second, and arguably more important. After all, you cannot stay inside forever. Hunting, fishing, traveling, and daily activities all required spending extended periods in the open air. exposed to temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. The indigenous solution to this problem is so effective that modern cold-weather gear manufacturers still study it. Despite billions of dollars in research and development, the best synthetic materials can barely match the thermal performance of traditional Arctic clothing. The secret lies in a single material, caribou fur. Specifically, the hollow hair structure of caribou fur creates an insulating layer that traps air more effectively than any synthetic fiber ever developed. Each individual hair contains tiny air pockets that create thermal barriers against heat loss. But it is not just about the material, it is about how that material is processed and assembled. Caribou hunting was traditionally timed to coincide with specific seasons, when the animals' coats were at their optimal state. Fall caribou provided the best fur for clothing, thick enough for insulation, but not so heavy as to restrict movement. Summer caribou fur was used for inner layers, where its shorter length reduced bulk while still providing insulation. The tanning and preparation process was equally sophisticated. Women, who traditionally prepared most clothing in Inuit and related cultures, developed techniques that kept the fur supple and effective. Brain tanning, using the animal's own brain tissue to condition the hide, created leather so soft it could be sewn with bone needles, yet durable enough to withstand constant use in extreme conditions. A complete traditional Arctic outfit consisted of multiple, carefully designed components. The inner parka, called an atigi, was worn with fur facing inward against the skin. The outer parka had fur facing outward, creating a double layer with an insulating air gap between. This layering system mirrors what modern outdoor gear companies call the three-layer system, except the indigenous version was perfected thousands of years earlier. Pants followed a similar pattern, with inner and outer layers providing both insulation and wind protection. The fit was carefully calibrated, loose enough to allow air circulation and prevent overheating during activity, but snug enough at cuffs and waist to prevent cold air infiltration. Footwear represented perhaps the most critical component. Muklux, the traditional Arctic boots, combined multiple materials in ingenious ways. Caribou leg skins provided the outer layer, tough, insulating, and naturally water-resistant due to the oil content of the leather. Inner liners of softer fur or grass provided additional insulation. Some designs included grass insoles that wickered moisture away from the feet while adding cushioning. The seams in these boots were particularly important. Sewn with sinew, the tough tendons from caribou, using specialized waterproof stitches, these seams could remain airtight even after thousands of miles of walking across ice and snow. Modern boot manufacturers, using the best available adhesives and synthetic threads, still struggle to match this durability. Mittens followed the same design principles. Double layered with fur in and out, attached to the parka with leather thongs to prevent loss, and sized to allow fingers to curl together for warmth when not in active use. The mitt design was favored over gloves because keeping fingers together dramatically improves their ability to stay warm. The hood of the parka, called an amautic in some designs that included space for carrying infants, featured a fur ruff around the face opening. This ruff, often made from wolverine or wolf fur because these furs do not collect frost from breath, created a microclimate of still air around the face, protecting the most vulnerable exposed skin. The entire outfit, when properly constructed and worn, could maintain comfort in temperatures well below -40 degrees Celsius, even during active work like pulling sleds or hunting on the ice. And unlike modern synthetic clothing, it rarely needed washing or specialized care. The natural oils in the fur repelled dirt and moisture. Airing the garments in the cold killed bacteria and refreshed the material. Perhaps most remarkably, this clothing system could be entirely self-sufficient. A skilled family could produce every component from materials available in their environment. No factories, no supply chains, no petroleum-based materials, just caribou seals and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to work with them. The physiological understanding embedded in this clothing system goes even deeper. Indigenous Arctic peoples recognize that the human body does not lose heat uniformly. The head accounts for a significant portion of heat loss due to its blood supply and lack of insulating fat. The hands and feet, being extremities, are particularly vulnerable to frostbite. The torso, containing vital organs, must be kept warm to maintain core temperature. The clothing system addressed each of these vulnerabilities specifically. Hoods were designed to cover the entire head while allowing adequate vision and hearing for hunting. Mittens were sized and insulated for maximum warmth. Boot design prioritized keeping feet dry and warm above all else, and the multi-layered torso garments maintained core temperature even in the most extreme conditions. But clothing alone was not enough. The real mastery came in understanding how to manage body temperature during different activities. One of the greatest dangers in Arctic survival is not actually the cold itself, it is sweat. When you exert yourself in cold weather, your body produces sweat to cool down. But that moisture trapped against your skin can freeze when you stop moving. Hypothermia from sweat cooling is a leading cause of death in cold environments, even for experienced outdoors people. Indigenous Arctic peoples developed sophisticated activity management techniques to prevent this. When engaged in heavy work like hunting or traveling, they would open vents in their clothing or remove layers to prevent sweating. They calibrated their pace to maintain warmth without overheating. They knew exactly how hard to work, for how long, before resting to prevent dangerous moisture accumulation. Children learned these techniques from earliest childhood. By the time they were adults, managing their body temperature in extreme cold was as natural as breathing. They could read the subtle signals from their bodies, the first hint of moisture, the warming that preceded sweating, and adjust their activity or clothing instantly. This behavioral thermoregulation complemented the clothing system perfectly. Together, they created a comprehensive approach to surviving the cold that addressed every aspect of the challenge, from the physics of heat transfer to the psychology of maintaining comfort in hostile conditions. The dietary component of cold survival was equally sophisticated. The traditional Arctic diet, heavy in animal fats and proteins, served specific metabolic purposes beyond simple nutrition. Fat provides more than twice the caloric energy of carbohydrates or protein, about 9 calories per gram, compared to 4. In an environment where maintaining body temperature required burning enormous amounts of energy, this caloric density was essential. A person working in extreme cold might need 5,000 or more calories daily to maintain weight and warmth. But beyond raw calories, the types of fat consumed made a difference. Marine mammal fats, from seals, whales, and walruses, contain high levels of omega-3 fatty acids that have been shown to improve circulation, particularly to extremities. This dietary pattern may have provided physiological advantages for maintaining warm hands and feet in extreme cold. Protein consumption also played a role. Digesting protein generates more metabolic heat than digesting fats or carbohydrates, a phenomenon called the thermic effect of food. Eating protein-rich meals before periods of cold exposure provided an internal heat source that supplemented external insulation. The timing of meals was carefully considered. Heavy meals before sleep helped maintain body temperature through the night. Lighter meals during travel prevented the blood flow to the digestive system that could compromise temperature regulation. Snacking on frozen fish or meat during the day provided steady energy without major metabolic disruptions. This nutritional knowledge, developed through millennia of experience, constitutes a complete science of cold weather metabolism. Modern researchers studying Arctic survival often rediscover principles that indigenous peoples have practiced for generations. No individual, no matter how skilled, could survive the Arctic alone for long. The harsh environment demanded cooperation on a scale that would have seemed extreme to peoples living in more temperate regions. And this cooperation was not just about sharing resources, it was woven into every aspect of Arctic indigenous life. Hunting large marine mammals like bowhead whales required crews of 20 or more people working in perfect coordination. A single successful whale hunt could provide food and fuel for an entire community for months. But failure, injury, or death were constant possibilities. Success depended on every person performing their role flawlessly. The boats used for whaling, called umiak, were themselves marvels of community craftsmanship. Driftwood frames covered with walrus or bearded seal hides created vessels that were simultaneously light enough to carry across ice and strong enough to withstand the thrashing of a harpooned whale. Building an umiak involved men crafting the frame, while women sewed the skin covering using waterproof stitches that took years to master. The division of labor in Arctic communities was precise but flexible. Men typically hunted large game and built structures. Women processed food, prepared hides, and made clothing. But these roles could shift based on need. A widow might hunt to feed her family. A man might sew his own emergency repairs to gear. The categories existed to organize essential work, not to limit individual capability. Children participated in community life from an early age. They helped process catches, learned crafts from elders, and practiced skills in play that would later save their lives. A child-first successful hunt was celebrated by the entire community, not just as a personal achievement, but as the community gaining another capable provider. Elders held particular status, not from seniority alone, but from knowledge. A grandmother who remembered a famine year knew which emergency foods to seek when regular hunting failed. A grandfather who had survived a particular type of icebreak could warn younger hunters about the warning signs. This knowledge, accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted across generations, was literally worth more than gold in an environment where a single mistake could prove fatal. Sharing was not charitable generosity, it was survival strategy. A hunter who killed a seal was expected to share portions with extended family and community members. This was not altruism. It was insurance. Next week, that hunter might come home empty-handed and others would share with him. The sharing networks ensured that temporary bad luck did not become fatal food shortage. This sharing extended to knowledge as well. A hunter who discovered a productive fishing spot would share that information. A woman who developed a better hide tanning technique would teach it to others. Hoarding knowledge, like hoarding food, was seen as dangerous to community survival, and social pressure against such hoarding was intense. The living arrangements reflected this communal orientation. Extended families often shared dwellings, pooling resources and body heat. Neighbors helped neighbors without expectation of immediate return. Strangers traveling through were offered food and shelter as a matter of course, because every traveler knew they might someday need the same hospitality. This brings us to a moment I think everyone watching needs to pause and reflect on. This level of community support, this absolute dedication to collective survival, represents something profound about human capability. In a world where we often feel isolated, where we sometimes wonder if genuine community is even possible anymore, these indigenous Arctic societies prove that humans can achieve extraordinary cooperation when circumstances demand it. If this story is touching something in you right now, if you are feeling inspired by the depth of human connection and resilience we are describing, leave a comment saying community is survival. Let us see how many of us recognize that truth. The social organization of Arctic communities also included sophisticated systems for resolving conflicts without violence. In an environment where every person mattered, where every injury could prove fatal, and where community cooperation was essential, violence between community members was nearly unthinkable. Disputes were settled through various means. Song duels where opponents traded insulting verses until one gave up. Wrestling matches. Community discussions where elders mediated. The goal was not to establish dominance or extract punishment. It was to restore social harmony so the community could continue functioning. This conflict resolution extended to relationships between communities as well. Trade networks connected Arctic peoples across thousands of miles. Communities that had never met in person knew of each other through these networks, exchanging not just goods but news, marriage partners and innovations. The annual gatherings where these trades occurred were major social events. Communities that had spent months in isolation would come together, exchange goods, share stories, arrange marriages, and reinforce the social bonds that connected them. These gatherings also served as information exchanges, reports of ice conditions, animal movements, and other survival-critical data flowed through the networks. Marriage patterns often served survival purposes. Marrying outside one home community created alliances and support networks. A person married into a distant community gained an alternative home if their own community faced hardship. Children of these marriages had connections to multiple communities, expanding their survival options. Beyond shelter, clothing, and community, Indigenous Arctic peoples developed an array of technologies specifically adapted to their frozen world. These innovations were not primitive precursors to modern equipment. They were sophisticated solutions that in many cases remain unsurpassed. The kayak stands as perhaps the most elegant example. Designed for hunting marine mammals in Arctic waters, the kayak represents thousands of years of refinement. Every element of its design serves specific survival functions. The closed deck kept water out, even when waves crashed over the vessel or the hunter capsized and rolled back up, a maneuver called the Eskimo roll that takes modern kayakers months to learn. The frame, made from driftwood and bone, was lashed together with sinew in ways that allowed it to flex with wave impacts rather than breaking. The skin covering, typically sealskin or caribou hide, was waterproofed with animal oil and could be repaired in the field. The dimensions of traditional kayaks varied by region and purpose, but all shared certain characteristics. They were narrow enough to be propelled efficiently by a single paddler, yet stable enough to allow the throwing motion needed for harpooning. They were light enough to be carried across ice, but durable enough to withstand collisions with ice floes. The paddle design was equally refined. Double-bladed paddles allowed for efficient forward propulsion, but the blade shapes and sizes varied based on local conditions. Wider blades for slow, powerful strokes in calm water. Narrower blades for quick, agile maneuvering near ice. A skilled kayaker in a traditional craft could navigate conditions that would swamp modern recreational kayaks. They could hunt seals in waters filled with floating ice, rolling with the waves, and righting themselves after capsizes. The kayak and its paddler functioned as a single integrated system, each element refined through generations of use. The dog sled represents another pinnacle of Arctic technology. Dogs had been companions of Arctic peoples for thousands of years, and the partnership between human and animal had evolved into an extraordinarily efficient transportation system. The sled itself was designed for maximum performance across varied Arctic terrain. The runners, originally made from frozen fish or mud-covered bone, slid across snow and ice with minimal friction. Later designs incorporated metal runners when trade made such materials available. The flexible construction, with components lashed together rather than rigidly joined, allowed the sled to flex across uneven ice without breaking. The harness system for the dogs was equally sophisticated. Different regions developed different configurations. Fan hitching allowed each dog to find its own path, while tandem hitching kept dogs in a line better suited for narrow trails. The materials and designs evolved to prevent injuries, distribute pulling force efficiently, and allow rapid attachment and detachment. But the technology was only half the equation. The other half was the dogs themselves, specifically the breeds developed over millennia for Arctic work. These dogs were not pets. They were working partners, selected over countless generations for endurance, cold tolerance, and the right temperament for sled work. A good lead dog was worth more than almost any possession. These animals could find trails in blizzard conditions when their human drivers were completely disoriented. They could sense thin ice before it broke. They could navigate by smell when neither stars nor landmarks were visible. The relationship between mushers and their dogs was intimate and complex. Dogs that performed well received extra food and care. Underperforming dogs might be culled, harsh but necessary, given the limited resources available. The best mushers knew each dog personality, strengths and weaknesses, as well as they knew their own family members. Travel across the Arctic was also facilitated by an intimate knowledge of ice that took lifetimes to fully develop. Hunters learned to read ice conditions the way others might read books, distinguishing safe ice from dangerous, recognizing signs of pressure ridges that could trap sleds, identifying the subtle indicators of open water ahead. This ice knowledge included understanding of sea ice formation, movement, and breakup patterns. Hunters knew when seasonal ice would be thick enough to support travel, where polynyas, areas of open water that remain unfrozen even in deep winter, could be found for hunting, and how to navigate the ever-changing frozen seascape. Young hunters served long apprenticeships with experienced elders, gradually learning to see what their teachers saw in the ice. This knowledge could not be learned from books. It had to be absorbed through experience, stored in muscle memory and intuition. A hunter who misjudged ice conditions might never return. Those who survived to old age had proven their judgment countless times. The technologies for hunting matched the sophistication of the transportation systems. Harpoons designed for marine mammal hunting incorporated multiple features that improved their effectiveness. The toggling harpoon head was perhaps the most important innovation. When the harpoon struck a seal or whale, the head detached from the shaft and turned sideways inside the animal body, creating an anchor point that could withstand enormous pulling force. A line connected the harpoon head to a float, typically an inflated seal skin, that both marked the animal location and tired it out as it tried to dive. This system allowed hunters to harvest animals many times their own weight from tiny, unstable kayaks. The float did the exhausting work of keeping the animal from diving deep, while the toggling head ensured the animal remained connected to the hunter line. Once exhausted, the animal could be dispatched with secondary weapons and towed to shore or ice. Other hunting technologies included the bolla, weighted stones connected by cords that could entangle flying birds, the bow and arrow refined for Arctic conditions, and numerous trap designs for land animals. Each represented centuries of refinement. Each was perfectly adapted to its specific purpose. Even seemingly simple tools showed sophisticated design. The ulu, or curved knife, traditionally used by women for processing hides and cutting food, featured an ergonomic shape that maximized cutting power while minimizing strain. The snow knife used for cutting igloo blocks had specific blade angles that created perfect cuts. Ice chisels for opening fishing holes were weighted and shaped to break through with maximum efficiency. Perhaps the most remarkable adaptation to Arctic life occurred not in tools or techniques, but in the bodies and minds of the people themselves. Over thousands of years, indigenous Arctic populations developed physiological and psychological traits that enhanced their survival in extreme cold. Research has shown that some Arctic indigenous populations have metabolic differences from people whose ancestors lived in temperate climates. These differences include higher basal metabolic rates. The body burns more calories at rest, generating more heat. Some studies suggest enhanced blood flow to extremities, reducing the risk of frostbite during cold exposure. These adaptations are not cultural, they are genetic, written into the DNA over countless generations of natural selection. Individuals whose bodies functioned better in cold survived longer and had more children. Over time, the population shifted toward cold-adapted physiologies. The psychological adaptations are equally significant, though harder to measure. Growing up in the Arctic demanded psychological resilience that most modern people never develop. Children learned from infancy that the environment was dangerous but manageable, that careful attention and proper behavior made survival possible. This produced adults who could remain calm in conditions that would panic those unfamiliar with the environment. An experienced Arctic hunter caught in a sudden blizzard on sea ice would not feel the terror that a newcomer might experience. Instead, they would assess their options, make decisions based on their training and experience, and take action with the confidence that came from having survived similar situations before. The darkness of Arctic winter posed particular psychological challenges. For weeks or months, the sun never rose above the horizon. The endless night could produce depression, irritability, and social tensions that threatened community cohesion. Arctic peoples developed cultural practices that addressed these psychological challenges. Celebrations and social gatherings punctuated the dark months. Storytelling, drum dancing, and games maintained community bonds and individual spirits. The seasonal rhythms of hunting and preparation gave structure to time when the sun could not. The seasonal changes also provided psychological relief. The return of the sun each spring was celebrated with festivals and feasts. The intense activity of the short summer, hunting, fishing, gathering, preparing, left little time for the melancholy that darkness might bring, and the knowledge that darkness would return created motivation to prepare thoroughly during the light months. This cyclical psychology, accepting the rhythm of extreme seasons rather than fighting it, represents a profound adaptation. Rather than seeing the Arctic as hostile, indigenous peoples integrated its patterns into their lives. The harsh winter was not punishment. It was simply one phase of a larger cycle that also included the abundance of summer. Children raised in this framework developed remarkable acceptance of conditions that outsiders found intolerable. Cold that would send southern visitors into heated shelters seemed normal, just the way things were. Darkness that might depress the unaccustomed was simply the time for indoor activities and social gathering. The environment was not conquered or endured, it was inhabited. This mental adaptation extended to attitudes toward death and danger. Arctic life was inherently risky. Hunters died on the ice. Travelers were lost in storms. Illness struck without warning. Yet communities maintained psychological stability despite these losses. The cultural approach was neither denial nor despair, but integration. Deaths were mourned, but life continued. The spirits of the dead were believed to remain present, perhaps even reborn into new community members. The practical necessities of survival demanded that grief not paralyze those who remained. This does not mean Arctic indigenous peoples were emotionally detached or uncaring. The bonds of family and community were deep and real. Parents loved children with the same intensity as parents anywhere. Couples formed lasting partnerships. Friends treasured each other. But love and loss were contextualized within an acceptance of life fragility that made psychological survival possible. The education of children reflected these values. From earliest childhood, kids learned that the environment demanded respect and attention. They learned practical skills gradually, moving from play practice to real participation as their abilities developed. They learned social skills, cooperation, sharing, conflict resolution, that would be essential to adult survival. Most importantly, they learned mental toughness. A child who cried from cold was comforted, but also taught that cold was manageable. A child who feared the dark was reassured, but also shown that darkness held no special dangers. Gradually, resilience was built into character until it became invisible, simply the normal way of being in the world. Modern researchers studying resilience, the ability to withstand and recover from adversity, often point to these indigenous communities as examples of cultures that systematically develop psychological strength. What modern psychology tries to teach through therapy and training, Arctic cultures embedded in childhood experience. This resilience carried Arctic peoples through not only the challenges of their environment, but also the catastrophic impacts of colonization. When outside powers arrived, with diseases, disrupted trade patterns, forced relocations, and cultural suppression, indigenous Arctic communities faced challenges their ancestors had never imagined. Yet many communities survived. Traditional knowledge was maintained, sometimes secretly. Languages persisted despite suppression. Cultural practices continued, adapted to new circumstances but maintaining their essential character. The same resilience that had allowed survival in -50 degrees proved equally valuable in surviving cultural assault. Today, Arctic indigenous communities face new challenges. Climate change is transforming the environment their cultures developed to inhabit. Ice patterns that guided hunters for generations are becoming unpredictable. Animal populations are shifting. Traditional knowledge, built over millennia of stable conditions, sometimes conflicts with rapidly changing reality. Yet communities are adapting, as they always have. New technologies are being integrated with traditional practices. Young people are learning ancestral skills while also acquiring modern education. The flexibility and resilience that enabled Arctic survival are being applied to contemporary challenges. As we reach the end of this journey through Arctic indigenous survival, it is worth reflecting on what these remarkable peoples can teach all of us, regardless of where we live or what challenges we face. The first lesson is about the relationship between humans and environment. Indigenous Arctic peoples did not conquer their environment. They adapted to it. They learned its patterns, respected its dangers, and found ways to work with rather than against its realities. In our era of climate change and environmental degradation, this approach has never been more relevant. Modern Western culture often frames nature as something to be controlled, dominated, or exploited. We build heated boxes to isolate ourselves from weather, import foods from thousands of miles away, rather than eating locally available resources, and spend enormous energy fighting natural conditions rather than adapting to them. The indigenous approach offers an alternative, not a return to pre-modern technology, but a philosophical shift toward cooperation with our environment. The second lesson concerns community and cooperation. Arctic survival was impossible without the support networks that connected individuals to families, families to communities, and communities to each other. In our increasingly isolated modern lives, we might ask what survival-critical cooperation we are missing. The sharing networks of Arctic communities ensured that temporary misfortune did not become catastrophe. The knowledge transmission from elders to youth preserved hard-won wisdom across generations. The conflict resolution practices maintained community cohesion under enormous stress. Each of these has modern applications that could strengthen our own communities. The third lesson is about resilience, not just surviving adversity but developing the capacity to withstand it. Arctic children were not sheltered from difficulty. They were gradually exposed to manageable challenges that built their ability to handle bigger ones. Modern parenting often does the opposite, protecting children from any discomfort and potentially leaving them unprepared for the inevitable difficulties of adult life. This does not mean we should subject children to suffering, but we might consider how they can develop capability through appropriate challenges rather than growing up unable to tolerate frustration or discomfort. The Arctic model suggests that resilience is built, not born, and that building it is one of the most valuable gifts adults can give children. The fourth lesson concerns the integration of knowledge and practice. Indigenous Arctic knowledge was not abstract learning stored in books. It was practical wisdom embedded in daily life. A hunter understanding of ice was not theoretical, it was felt in the bones, expressed in confident decisions made under pressure. Modern education often separates knowing from doing, creating people who understand concepts but cannot apply them effectively. The Indigenous approach, learning through apprenticeship, practice, and gradual assumption of responsibility, produced people who could perform under pressure because their knowledge was inseparable from their capability. The fifth lesson is about acceptance. Arctic peoples accepted the reality of their environment rather than wishing it were different. They accepted that some years the hunting would be poor and prepared accordingly. They accepted that people would die and maintained psychological stability despite this truth. They accepted the rhythms of darkness and light, scarcity and abundance, effort and rest. Modern culture often struggles with acceptance. We resist aging, deny death, reject limitations and fight against circumstances we cannot change. The Indigenous Arctic approach suggests that accepting reality, clearly seeing what is, might be more effective than constantly fighting against it. The final lesson is perhaps the most important. Human capability is far greater than we typically imagine. People living without any technology we would recognize as modern not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would kill most of us within hours. They raised families, created art, developed rich cultures, and maintained communities for thousands of years in an environment that seems impossibly harsh. If they could do that, what might we be capable of? What challenges that seem insurmountable might actually be manageable with the right knowledge, community support, and mental approach? The example of Indigenous Arctic peoples suggests that human limits are far wider than we usually assume. These lessons do not require us to abandon modern technology or move to the Arctic. They invite us to reconsider our assumptions about what humans can achieve, how we relate to our environment, and how we might better support each other through challenges. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic faced -50 degrees with caribou skin parkas and seal oil lamps. They navigated frozen seas in skin-covered kayaks. They raised children in semi-underground sod houses through months of darkness. And they did not just survive. They created rich, meaningful lives filled with family, community, beauty, and purpose. Their example stands as a testament to human capability, a reminder that our species has met and overcome challenges that seemed impossible. Whatever difficulties we face today, we might draw courage from their example. If humans could master the Arctic with Stone Age technology, surely we can face our own challenges with the resources we now possess. The cold still comes to the Arctic each winter. The darkness still descends, and indigenous communities still live there, now blending traditional knowledge with modern tools, maintaining cultures that have survived for millennia while adapting to contemporary realities. Their story is not history, it is ongoing. And the lessons they offer remain as relevant today as they were 10,000 years ago, when the first humans looked at the frozen north and decided, yes, we can live here. What strikes me most about these indigenous Arctic communities is how they transformed what appeared to be the harshest possible conditions into the foundation for rich, meaningful lives. They discovered abundance where others perceived only emptiness. They constructed warmth in the coldest environments on Earth. They forged profound connections despite their isolation. There is something deeply inspiring about this, not in any mystical sense, but in the profound human capacity to transform limitation into possibility. These communities did not merely endure, they flourished. They developed sophisticated art forms, intricate oral traditions, complex social structures, and technologies that still impress modern engineers. The Arctic was not a prison they escaped from, but a home they chose to make their own. The wisdom of the Arctic is not locked in the past. It speaks to us today with urgent relevance. As our modern world grapples with environmental crises, social fragmentation, and the challenges of building sustainable communities, the lessons from these indigenous peoples offer a roadmap we desperately need. Consider the environmental wisdom. These communities lived in balance with their ecosystem for thousands of years without depleting it. They took what they needed and no more. They understood that their survival depended on the health of the animals, the ice, and the land. This was not abstract environmentalism. It was practical survival knowledge encoded in daily practice. Modern society struggles with this balance. We extract resources at unsustainable rates. We generate waste our environment cannot absorb. We alter climate systems in ways that threaten our own survival. The indigenous Arctic approach, treating the environment as a partner rather than a resource to exploit, offers an alternative framework we desperately need. Consider the social wisdom. These communities maintained cohesion through sharing, mutual support, and non-violent conflict resolution. They valued elders for their knowledge and children for their potential. They created systems where no one fell through the cracks because falling through the cracks meant death. Modern society often fails at these basics. We isolate the elderly. We compete rather than cooperate. We resolve conflicts through litigation or violence rather than restoration. We let people fall into homelessness and poverty, while others accumulate far more than they need. The indigenous Arctic approach, building genuine community through mutual obligation, offers lessons we have forgotten. Consider the psychological wisdom. These communities raised resilient children who could face extreme adversity without breaking. They maintained mental health through dark winters and constant danger. They found meaning and purpose in the hardest possible circumstances. Modern society struggles with mental health despite unprecedented material abundance. We medicate anxiety and depression at record rates. We raise children who sometimes cannot cope with ordinary difficulties. We search for meaning in consumption and distraction. The indigenous Arctic approach, building resilience through challenge and finding meaning through contribution to community, offers alternatives worth exploring. The story of indigenous Arctic survival is ultimately a story about human potential. It reminds us that our species is capable of far more than our comfortable modern lives suggest. When circumstances demand it, humans can adapt to almost anything. We can find ways to thrive where survival itself seems impossible. This is not a call to return to the past. Modern technology and knowledge have genuine value, but perhaps we can learn to combine the best of modern capability with the wisdom of peoples who solved problems we are only now rediscovering. The Arctic wind still howls across the tundra. The temperatures still plummet to extremes that would kill the unprepared. But for those who carry the knowledge of their ancestors, who maintain the connections to community, who have built the resilience to face whatever comes, the Arctic remains home. And perhaps, in learning from their example, we can make the whole Earth feel more like home for all of us. Remember, knowledge, community, and resilience. These three pillars held up entire civilizations in the harshest conditions imaginable. They can hold us up too, whatever challenges the future brings. The Arctic taught these lessons in ice and snow. We can learn them wherever we are. If you watch this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. If this story inspired you, if it made you think differently about human capability, community, or resilience, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps bring more stories of remarkable human achievement to others who might find them meaningful. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week we explore the extraordinary things humans have accomplished, stories that remind us what we are truly capable of when we work together, adapt to our circumstances, and refuse to give up. The Arctic peoples survived -50 degrees through knowledge, cooperation, and resilience. We can carry those same principles into whatever challenges we face. Their story is our story, part of the vast human experiment in survival, adaptation, and flourishing against all odds. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring about these stories, and thank you for being part of this community that celebrates human capability in all its remarkable forms. Until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and never underestimate what humans can achieve.